Welcome to Discipleship for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So to outline our mission for today's deep dive, we're going to explore Book the First of St. John of the Cross's 16th century masterpiece, The Dark Night of the Soul.
Right. And we're not just going to, read it like a history textbook. We have a very specific framework for this deep dive.
Exactly. As mentors to you, the listener, our goal today is to examine St. John's profound insights into what he calls the night of sense.
And we're going to evaluate those insights strictly against the 8 core instructions of Jesus for discipleship.
Right. Those 8 core instructions being repentance and faith, self-denial and cross-bearing, total devotion to God's kingdom, humility and service, the law of love, secret obedience, forgiveness, and fruitfulness.
Yeah, that's our measuring stick. We want to see where St. John's internal mystical theology aligns perfectly with Christ's call. But we also need to explore where the struggle of true discipleship gets complicated.
Yeah, or where his hyper-internal focus might even rub against Jesus's intensely outward commands. So let's start with a scenario. Imagine doing everything right,
Okay, setting the scene.
You're praying consistently, you're serving your community, fasting, reading scripture, and your reward for all this diligent faithfulness is that God seemingly abandons you.
Oof. Yeah, that's a tough spot.
Right. You wake up one morning and you feel absolutely nothing. The joy is gone. That palpable electric feeling of God's presence that used to move you to tears in worship just vanished.
In almost any modern church context, we would immediately diagnose you as failing.
Exactly. We'd ask what secret sin you're hiding, or if you're burning out, or if you need counseling.
But a 16th century friar looks at that devastating, terrifying emptiness and says, this is actually the greatest spiritual upgrade you could ever receive.
He calls it a happy chance, which is just wild to think about.
It completely shatters our modern paradigm of what spiritual health looks like.
It really does. So to understand why St. John calls a state of devastating dryness a happy chance, we probably need to get a little bit of the world behind the text.
Yes, some historical context is key here. This book, The Dark Night of the Soul, is actually a commentary. St. John wrote this incredible, mysterious poem called Stanzas of the Soul.
Right, and this text is basically him breaking down what those stanzas actually mean.
Exactly. And Book the First is aimed at a very specific audience. He is writing about and directly to people he calls beginners in the spiritual life.
Okay, wait. I think we need to define beginner here. Because when I hear that word, I immediately think of someone who, walked down to an altar yesterday.
Right, or someone opening a Bible for the very first time.
Yeah, but that isn't who he is talking to, is it?
Not at all. In St. John's specific vocabulary, a beginner is someone who has been on the spiritual road for quite a while.
Ah, so they're not newbies.
No, they've already gone through initial conversion. They're spending time meditating. They've probably experienced a tremendous amount of initial sweetness and consolation in their spiritual exercises.
So we are talking about the person who is leading the small group, right? The person who prays for an hour every morning.
Exactly, the one reading all the heavy theological books. But St. John's startling diagnosis is that despite all this frantic, dedicated activity, they have not yet acquired mature habits of spirituality.
So internally, they're still acting like spiritual children.
Precisely, which brings up the central metaphor of this entire section, and it's a really vivid one.
Oh, the nursing mother analogy. Yeah, he says that when a soul first converts and begins to serve God, God acts exactly like a loving nursing mother.
Right, the mother warms this tender, fragile child at her breast and feeds it with sweet milk.
She carries the child in her arms everywhere, caressing it, protecting it from the harshness of the world.
And in the spiritual life, this is that initial phase where God makes you find this sweet, delectable pleasure in spiritual things.
Everything just feels effortless. Like the worship music hits perfectly, prayer feels like an easy dialogue, and you feel completely wrapped up in God's presence.
But then St. John introduces the turn. He observes that as a child grows, the mother has to change her approach if that child is ever going to survive in the real world.
She has to hide her tender love, essentially.
Right. She actually puts bitter aloes on her breast to force the child to wean off the sweet milk.
Oh, wow, yeah. She sets the child down from her safe arms and makes it walk on its own 2 feet.
And she does this entirely out of love, right? So the child can lose the habits of an infant and take on the robust occupations of an adult.
It's like spiritual training wheels. When you first learn to ride a bike, Those training wheels keep you upright without you having to understand balance or momentum at all.
You feel like you're flying, and it's completely effortless.
Exactly. But eventually, if you're actually going to ride, a good parent has to take those artificial supports off.
And when they do, you wobble immediately.
Right. You fall and scrape your knees. It feels terrible. And you look up at the parent and think, why are you letting me fall? I thought you loved me.
Yeah, but taking away the support is literally the only way you learn the actual mechanics of riding.
Right. That makes so much sense.
Though we need to push that analogy even further to capture St. John's urgency. He is talking about an actual deep-seated attachment to the sweetness.
Okay, so it's more intense than just training wheels.
Yeah, it's less like taking off training wheels and more like going through a painful neurological detox from sugar. The brain literally screams for the high it used to get.
Wow, so the beginner doesn't just miss the training wheels, they are actively addicted to the milk.
Exactly. They are demanding to be carried. And if we connect this to the core instructions, this transition perfectly mirrors Jesus' call to self-denial and cross-bearing.
Because discipleship cannot remain in the comfort of being carried.
Right. Jesus said that to follow him, you must put aside selfish ambition and take up your cross daily.
Which you obviously can't do if you're being carried. You can't physically carry a cross if you are simultaneously demanding to be carried in your mother's arms.
Precisely. True discipleship requires stepping out of that sweet, effortless consolation and actually bearing the weight of the journey on your own 2 feet.
The muscle atrophy that happens when you were always carried just has to be reversed.
Yeah. So the obvious question here is, why is the sweet milk suddenly toxic?
Right. Because if God gave the sweetness in the first place, why does St. John act like keeping it will destroy the believer?
This is where we get into his incredibly detailed, almost surgical diagnosis of the beginner's soul.
He essentially argues that if God doesn't actively strip away the sweetness, it will literally poison the believer.
Yeah. And to explain this, he uses the classic framework of the 7 deadly sins. But he does something fascinating. He translates them into spiritual sins.
This is the real spiritual burden of this entire section of the book, right?
Yes. St. John diagnoses that beginners, because they are still immature, become addicted to the feelings of spiritual exercises rather than addicted to God himself.
Oh, man. Because they lack deep, tested habits of virtue, their seemingly good actions like their prayers, their fasts become completely corrupted.
Corrupted by the 7 capital sins, exactly. The terrifying thing is that they are doing holy things, but with deeply unholy, childish motivations.
I have to say, reading through this list of spiritual sins is an incredibly uncomfortable experience. It feels like you wrote this yesterday about our modern church culture.
It really hits close to home. Let's start dissecting these. The first one he tackles is spiritual pride.
Okay, spiritual pride.
He points out that beginners, precisely because they feel so fervent and diligent in their new spiritual disciplines, develop this insidious secret pride.
Because they're reading their Bible every day and having these great emotional prayer sessions, they suddenly want to teach everyone else rather than learn.
Exactly. They start looking down on people who don't share their specific, intense type of devotion.
He says they resemble the Pharisee from the Gospel of Luke, right? The one who stood in the temple and boasted of his own fasting while despising the tax collector.
Yeah, they are incredibly adept at seeing the speck in their brother's eye while being entirely blind to the plank in their own.
The sweetness they feel in prayer essentially convinces them they are spiritually superior.
And the specific behaviors he calls out are just wild. He talks about beginners faking sighs or making outward physical movements in public just so other people will notice how deeply spiritual they are.
Wait, really? Faking sighs in church?
Yes. Or they try to become the favorite of their confessor or pastor. They will actually cover up their real ugly sins in confession because they want their spiritual director to think they are basically already saints.
Wow, so they just want to maintain their image.
Exactly. Let's hold that up against the core instructions of Jesus. This behavior is a blatant, direct violation of the command for secret obedience.
Because Jesus explicitly warned, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them.
Right? He commanded that acts of giving, prayer, and fasting should be done in absolute secrecy, to be seen only by the Father.
But spiritual pride takes the outward performance of religion and weaponizes it as a tool for social status.
It completely violates humility and service, too. Jesus said that to be great in the kingdom, you must be the servant of all.
But the spiritually proud beginner has zero desire to serve. They just want to be admired. They want the best seat at the table.
They want to be the master.
Yeah.
Which actually bleeds right into the next problem.
Because if you are secretly proud of your spiritual status, you start wanting the accessories to match.
Which is what St. John calls spiritual avarice or spiritual greed.
Now, when we typically think of greed, we think of hoarding money or real estate, right?
Right. But St. John is talking about people hoarding curious rosaries, relics, and spiritual books.
He describes them tossing one cross aside to pick up another, constantly looking for a newer, cooler item, like adorning themselves with religious tokens exactly the way children play with shiny trinkets. The mechanism he's exposing here is the attachment of the heart, isn't it?
Yes. He recounts knowing a person who carried a rough cross made from a blessed branch for 10 years, and they were totally, unhealthily attached to this physical object.
I remember that part. St. John actually took it away from him, which to a beginner seems cruel.
It does seem cruel. But St. John saw that the object had replaced God. This directly conflicts with Jesus' instruction for total devotion.
Because Jesus was crystal clear, you cannot serve two masters. You must seek first the kingdom of God.
Exactly. When you become obsessed with the physical and aesthetic accessories of religion, you are seeking the accessory, not the kingdom.
You're confusing the instrument of devotion with the actual object of devotion, but I have to be honest here.
Go for it.
As someone reading this today, his view of spiritual avarice feels incredibly harsh. Like, why is it a sin to want a nice study Bible?
That's a fair question.
Or to buy a beautifully bound journal for your prayer times? Or to curate an aesthetically pleasing worship space in your home that feels overly puritanical? Help me understand why he draws such a hard line here.
It's a really fair pushback. But he isn't saying that books or crosses or journals are inherently evil. The sin lies in the possessiveness and the distraction.
So it's about the attachment.
Right. If losing your perfect journaling Bible completely derails your prayer life for a week, then the Bible was your idol, not God.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
St. John is targeting the consumer mindset that believes we can accumulate our way into deeper holiness. It's the illusion that if I just buy the right commentary or attend the right exclusive conference, I will finally achieve spiritual mastery.
That makes a lot of sense. That is greed. It's an attempt to purchase or hoard what can only be given freely by grace.
Yeah.
So it's the modern equivalent of having like 5 different highlighters and 3 leather-bound Bibles, but never actually applying the Sermon on the Mount to your life.
Exactly. It's the aesthetic of devotion without the reality of submission.
Which leads us perfectly into the third and arguably most intense diagnosis: spiritual gluttony.
Oh, spiritual gluttony. St. John says beginners get so lured by the sweetness of spiritual exercises that they start gorging themselves.
They start killing themselves with excessive fasts, or they demand frequent communion, or they pile on extra prayers just to get a spiritual sugar rush.
They will actually ignore the direct advice of their spiritual directors or pastors to stop doing this.
And here I have to play devil's advocate. Wait a minute. Isn't doing more spiritual disciplines inherently a good thing?
You would think so.
If someone in my church wants to fast for 3 days instead of 1, shouldn't we applaud that zeal?
Not if we look at the underlying mechanism. Not if it is done out of a desire to satisfy your own will rather than God's.
So it raises a massive question about the true nature of obedience.
Yes, and St. John uses a phrase here that is just devastating. He calls this the penance of beasts.
The penance of beasts? That is intense. Why beasts?
Because it is driven purely by appetite. Think about how an animal acts. It acts on instinct and appetite.
Right. It eats what it wants, when it wants, and stops when it wants.
Exactly. When a beginner fasts or prays excessively against the counsel of their spiritual directors simply because it feels good to them, they are acting on appetite.
They get an emotional high from feeling hyper-spiritual. They're feeding their own ego, not denying it.
So they're basically getting drunk on the feeling of their own willpower.
Ow.
They want to control their own spiritual metrics because it gives them a false sense of mastery.
They'd rather fast for 3 days on their own terms than submit to their boss or their spouse in actual humility for 10 minutes.
That is exactly the dynamic. True self-denial, according to Jesus, means submitting your will entirely.
The paradox that St. John points out is that sometimes true self-denial means doing less of something you enjoy, even if that thing is a seemingly holy spiritual discipline.
Right, simply to practice obedience and submission. St. John says these beginners set bodily penance before subjection and obedience, which makes it a vicious extreme.
They think their own emotional satisfaction is the exact same thing as serving God. And when that emotional satisfaction stops, well, everything falls apart.
Which brings us to the final cluster of spiritual sins. Spiritual wrath, envy, and sloth.
Because when the dopamine hit of that spiritual sweetness fades, the withdrawal kicks in. He details how beginners get furious when the sweetness ends.
They become easily irritated by the sins of others. They feel deeply envious if someone else is praised for their spirituality.
Or if someone else has a profound spiritual experience, they just get jealous. And as for sloth, the second a spiritual practice doesn't feel good anymore, they just run away from it.
Right. They completely abandon the difficult, dry disciplines.
If we look at the core instructions, this behavior completely contradicts the law of love and the command for fruitfulness.
Jesus was emphatic. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce the bitter fruit of spiritual rage.
Jesus commanded disciples to love their enemies and to treat others as they wish to be treated. If your intense spiritual practices are making you angry and hyper-judgmental, your tree is producing bad fruit.
Exactly. St. John points out that if true charity has any envy at all, it should be a holy envy.
Oh, I like that term, holy envy.
Yeah, where you simply wish you could imitate the genuine goodness you see in others, rather than resenting them for having it.
So we have this comprehensive, devastating diagnosis. The beginner is addicted to the sugar of early spiritual life.
And their religious practices are actually breeding pride, greed, gluttony, wrath, envy, and sloth.
And the scariest part is they think they're doing great because they're cloaking all these sins in religious language.
Right. And human effort alone cannot cure these deeply rooted spiritual addictions. You can't just grit your teeth and try harder to not be proud.
Because the more you try to fix your pride, the more proud you become of your efforts, right?
Yes. So St. John says God must actively intervene. The mother must forcefully take the child off the breast.
And this aggressive, loving intervention is the dark night.
Yes, the cure. We are entering the dark night of sense.
Okay, so what St. John means by this is that God is actively, intentionally weaning the soul from meditation into contemplation.
Now, to make sure we don't lose anyone here, we need to define those two terms exactly as he uses them, because they mean something very specific in this text.
Right. Meditation, for St. John, is an active process. It is the work you do.
It is using your imagination, your reasoning, your memory to think about God.
It's like reading a passage of scripture and picturing the scene in your mind, reasoning through the theology, and generating an emotional response.
Right. It's the gears of your brain actively grinding. You are pulling the levers.
Exactly. Contemplation, on the other hand, is entirely passive. It is a pure, dark, secret infusion of God's love directly into the soul.
God is deliberately starving the senses so that the spirit can be fed. The sensual, emotional, imaginative part of the soul is being forcibly shut down so the deep spiritual part can finally be activated and enlarged.
But this creates a massive diagnostic problem, doesn't it? I mean, if a listener is experiencing this right now, their first thought isn't going to be, oh, wonderful, God is granting me passive contemplation.
No, definitely not. Their first terror is going to be, I am backsliding,
Yeah.
I have lost my salvation, or I'm doing something horribly wrong.
Because honestly, just feeling dry and empty in prayer could mean a lot of things. It could mean you were living in unrepentant sin. So how does St. John differentiate this dark night from just normal worldly distraction or spiritual failure?
He anticipates this exact panic. In chapter 9, St. John lays out an escalating diagnostic process. He gives 3 very specific signs to prove that what you are experiencing is the purifying dark night of sense.
Not just your own spiritual negligence.
Right, so the first sign is this. You find absolutely no pleasure or consolation in the things of God. But crucially, you also find no pleasure in created things.
That is such a vital distinction, because if I am just backsliding, or if I've committed some hidden sin and my conscience is seared, I might lose my taste for reading the Bible or praying. But I will immediately compensate for that emptiness by finding a ton of pleasure in worldly things. I'll lose myself in Netflix or food or socializing or workaholism. I'll replace the spiritual dopamine with physical dopamine.
Exactly. The worldly person turns away from God to enjoy the world. But in the dark night, God systematically quenches the desire for everything.
Wow. You try to pray, and it's like eating sand, but then you try to go watch a movie, and it's excruciatingly boring.
You try to hang out with friends, and it just feels hollow and meaningless. God is actively shutting down all avenues of sensual pleasure. both spiritual and earthly.
So that you cannot find rest anywhere but in him, even though you can't feel him either.
Precisely.
Okay, but what if they look at that total lack of pleasure in everything and think it's clinical depression? Because what you just described, anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure in anything, is a textbook symptom of major depressive disorder. How does he rule that out?
That brings us to his second diagnostic sign, which I think is a brilliant piece of psychological insight from a man living hundreds of years before modern psychology.
It really is. St. John says that to differentiate the dark night from pure melancholy or lukewarmness, you have to look at the memory and the will.
Yes. In the dark night, the memory is continually centered on God with painful care and solicitude.
A lukewarm person, like a backslider, doesn't actually care that they feel distant from God. They are apathetic. They are relieved they don't have to pray anymore.
But the soul in the dark night is agonized by it. They are gripped with this painful, constant anxiety that they are failing God, that they're moving backward, that they have offended him.
Yes. He explicitly says it is the nature of lukewarmness not to care greatly. The person in the dark night is suffering precisely because they love God and feel like they can't reach him.
They're terrified. That agonizing care, that deep anxiety about the state of their soul is the absolute proof that the deep spirit is actually strong, alert, and desperately reaching for God.
Even while the flesh and the emotions feel dead and empty, if you were truly backsliding, you just wouldn't care this much.
And that leads to the final confirmation, the third sign. There is an absolute inability to meditate or reflect using the imagination.
The brain simply refuses to work the way it used to during prayer. You try to picture Jesus on the cross or reason through a theological concept, and your mind hits a blank, impenetrable wall.
St. John says God is now communicating by pure spirit into which consecutive reflections cannot enter.
The old tools of the imagination, the training wheels, simply cannot grasp what God is doing now.
So let's put ourselves in the listener's shoes. You are sitting there in your room. You have no pleasure in prayer and no pleasure in the world.
You are agonizing over your relationship with God, terrified that you're failing, and your brain won't even let you pray the way you used to. You feel totally paralyzed.
What are you supposed to do? In chapter 10, St. John gives his advice on how to behave in the night.
Yeah.
And his advice is so counterintuitive.
He basically says, do nothing, don't force it, remain in peaceful and loving attentiveness.
Which goes against every single instinct we have as modern, proactive people. When we feel distant from God, our immediate reflex is to work harder.
We try to force our faculties to concentrate. We try to manufacture the feelings we used to have by playing louder music or reading more aggressive books.
But St. John says that doing this actually hinders the delicate work God is trying to do. You are fatiguing your nature for no reason, and you are disturbing the quietness that God requires to work.
I thought of an analogy for this. It's like a person sitting for a portrait. The painter is God, and he's trying to do this incredibly delicate, detailed work on the canvas of your soul.
Okay, I like this.
But you, the sitter, keep panicking because you can't see the canvas and you don't feel anything happening, so you keep jumping out of the chair, grabbing a brush and trying to help the painter.
And the painter is just saying, please sit still, you are ruining the painting, you are smudging the lines, just let me do the work. But sitting still while a painter works on you implies you actually trust the painter. What happens when the soul in the dark night starts to doubt if God is even holding the brush?
Oh, because that's the real terror, isn't it? You are sitting in the dark and you aren't sure if God is painting or if he just left the room entirely.
That is the ultimate test of faith.
Yeah.
St. John says that if the soul tries to make an effort with its interior faculties during this time, it will hinder and lose the blessings that God is instilling in peace and ease.
Because contemplation is a secret, peaceful, and loving infusion from God. You just have to be present and attentive.
You have to endure the uncertainty of the dark room, trusting that the artist hasn't abandoned you.
But sitting in the dark feels so utterly useless. It feels like a massive waste of time, especially for ambitious Christians. We want to be producing.
But St. John insists that immense unseen construction is happening in this paralysis.
So what exactly is being built? If we are going to endure this detox, we need to know what the fruits of this night are.
Right. In chapters 12 and 13, St. John details the profound benefits of this aridity. And the very first, most principal benefit, the foundation of everything else, is self-knowledge.
Self-knowledge.
When you are forcefully stripped of all your spiritual highs, your emotional consolations, and your perceived theological successes, you finally, truly see your own absolute misery and lowliness.
You realize that without God's constant, active grace, you are nothing. He uses two incredible biblical examples to illustrate this. First, Moses taking off his shoes at the burning bush.
Right. Moses couldn't approach God with his shoes on. He had to be stripped of his own covering. He had to physically enact his own lowliness and wretchedness before he was capable of hearing the actual word of God.
And then he points to Job on the dunghill. Job didn't receive God's deepest revelation when he was wealthy and prosperous and doing everything right ritually.
God spoke to him out of the whirlwind only after Job was naked on a dunghill, covered in sores, totally abandoned, and completely stripped of his own self-righteousness.
The darkness forces the soul to see its own absolute poverty.
And from that deeply painful self-knowledge comes the second benefit, a deep, genuine respect for God.
When you are no longer puffed up by your own spiritual sweetness, when you realize you aren't God's peer or favorite, you stop approaching God with greedy familiarity.
You approach him with profound courtesy and reverence. Your presumption is completely gone. You realize God is God, and you are not.
And this naturally leads to the third benefit, which is an incredible systemic shift in spiritual humility and charity.
Because the soul is now so hyper-aware of its own wretchedness, it stops judging others entirely.
Remember that spiritual pride we talked about earlier? The beginner who constantly condemned others for not praying enough, that completely evaporates.
St. John says the soul is aware only of its own wretchedness, which it keeps before its eyes to such an extent that it never forgets it, nor takes occasion to set its eyes on anyone else.
Let's align this with Jesus' instructions. This is the mechanical process by which the law of love and forgiveness is actually achieved in a human heart.
You cannot hold grudges or judge your neighbor when you are profoundly existentially aware of your own spiritual poverty.
When you realize that you bring absolutely nothing to the table, that your own best efforts are useless without grace, forgiving someone else's failures becomes totally natural.
You aren't offended by their sin because you are so aware of your own capacity for the exact same thing.
As St. John says, any envy you have becomes a holy envy. You just wish you could imitate the goodness you see in others because you know how desperately far you have to go.
And finally, he says the soul gains true liberty of spirit. Because the brain's dopamine receptors, what St. John would call the sensual appetite, are no longer being hijacked by the sugar rush of emotional worship or worldly pleasure.
The mind literally rewires itself to find peace and stillness. This is the mechanical origin of patience, self-control, and the 12 fruits of the Holy Spirit.
The soul is freed from the manipulation of the world, the flesh, and the devil. Because the pleasure of sense is quenched, the devil has no leverage anymore.
He can't tempt you with pleasure if pleasure no longer holds any power over you.
Sensuality has no weapons against a spirit that has learned to survive in the dark. The tree has been violently pruned, and now it could actually bear real lasting fruit.
St. John paints a masterful, terrifyingly beautiful picture of internal purification. He is undeniably a genius of the interior life.
But as mentors looking at this text through the lens of Jesus' core instructions, we have to ask a hard question. Is anything missing here?
Right. Are there gaps or imbalances in this medieval framework that a modern disciple needs to be wary of? Because our mission isn't just to blindly praise the text.
No, it's to bring it into modern, clear understanding for discipleship today. And there is a massive tension here that we need to address directly.
St. John's entire framework is aggressively, relentlessly inward. It is almost exclusively focused on the psychological, emotional, and mystical states of the individual believer sitting alone in prayer.
That is the primary gap we need to analyze. While St. John beautifully, perfectly addresses the internal motivations behind Jesus' commands, the why of humility, the why of self-denial,
his text almost completely sidelines the outward physical actions that Jesus actually commanded.
Exactly. Let's compare them directly to see the friction. Jesus places a massive emphasis on external, physical, relational actions.
The core instructions are full of them. Literally feeding the poor, visiting those in prison, forgiving those who physically strike you on the cheek, washing your disciples' dirty feet.
Jesus' vision of discipleship is highly relational, incredibly messy, and very physical.
But St. John's hyper-focus on personal, mystical darkness actually makes it quite difficult to practice the outward fruitfulness Jesus commanded.
If you are sitting in a dark room, paralyzed by your own lack of spiritual feeling, focused entirely on the microscopic movements of your own soul, who is feeding the poor, who is evangelizing?
His focus is on purging the desire for external things, moving the soul from active engagement into passive contemplation. So how do we reconcile this? Is St. John just wrong?
To exercise fair discernment, we have to clarify that this isn't necessarily a flaw in St. John's theology as a whole. His specific stated goal in this particular book was diagnosing mystical prayer and the internal journey of the soul.
So he wasn't trying to write a comprehensive manual on social ethics or community service.
No, exactly. You wouldn't fault a cardiologist for not writing a chapter on orthopedics. He is a heart specialist.
That's a great distinction. But for you, the modern listener, there's a real danger here if you take St. John's Dark Night out of context and use it as your entire theological framework.
You must be incredibly careful not to use the Dark Night as an excuse to withdraw from the messy, active, relational community of discipleship that Jesus requires.
You can't just sit in a dark room contemplating your own spiritual dryness while ignoring the poor or abandoning your church community or holding a grudge against your neighbor.
Jesus requires both the internal purity that St. John describes and the external action. You still have to love your neighbor even when your prayer life feels like a desert.
That is a crucial translation for the 21st century. How does this challenge the way believers think and live today? Let's apply this deeply to modern church culture.
I think St. John is speaking directly to our current moment. If you look at modern discipleship, especially in the West, good worship is almost exclusively defined by emotional highs.
It's about the swelling chord progressions on the guitar, the perfect stage lighting, the charismatic, funny speaker, the feeling of being moved to tears.
We have built an entire multi-billion-dollar religious industry around generating the exact sweet milk that St. John says keeps us as spiritual infants.
Oh, that is so painfully true. We equate feeling good with God's presence, and we equate feeling dry or bored with God's absence.
We have entire megachurches built on keeping people addicted to spiritual gluttony.
We binge listen to theological podcasts to feel smart, which is spiritual pride and greed, but we don't actually apply the teachings to how we treat our spouses or our coworkers.
St. John totally challenges that entire paradigm. He is telling the modern believer that spiritual dryness you are feeling, it might not mean the worship team failed.
It might not mean the pastor picked the wrong sermon topic. And it might not mean you need to leave your church to find a more spirit-filled environment.
It might mean God is honoring you by maturing you. He is taking away the milk.
So, we want to hold up a mirror for you right now. Here is a practical application and a deeply uncomfortable reflection.
Are you measuring your spiritual health by how much pleasure you get out of prayer? Or by how many chills you get during a worship song?
Or are you measuring it by your quiet, unglamorous obedience when the feelings are totally, absolutely gone?
That is the ultimate test of total devotion. Do you love God, or do you just love the way God makes you feel?
Are you worshiping the Creator, or are you worshiping the dopamine hit that the Creator's accessories provide?
To put this into practice this week, try this. The next time you feel completely dry in prayer or bored by a spiritual discipline or uninspired by a Sunday service, do not immediately try to fix the feeling.
Don't immediately jump to a new book, a new podcast, or a new church to chase that emotional high. Instead, practice the peaceful and loving attentiveness that St. John describes.
Sit in the quiet. Acknowledge the dryness. Don't fight it. And offer that dryness itself to God as a sacrifice of self-denial.
Lord, I feel absolutely nothing right now, but I am staying in the chair anyway because I love you, not the feelings you give me. That is a profoundly powerful, mature prayer.
It is the prayer of a true disciple. But before we conclude, we need a final layer of discernment regarding some of the extreme elements of St. John's 16th century medieval world.
Right, because if you go and read this text for yourself, which we hope you do, you are going to hit some roadblocks.
Yes, because the language is very intense. We already talked about the penance of beasts. But he also talks about intense spiritual warfare in ways that sound very foreign to a modern ear.
He mentions the spirit of fornication aggressively buffeting the senses, and this dizzying, confusing demon he calls the spiritus vertiginus that fills the mind with scruples and perplexities. It reads like a horror novel in parts.
It's important to navigate these ancient assumptions carefully. St. John was a 16th century Carmelite friar writing in a highly monastic worldview.
Right. Extreme physical asceticism and highly personified demonic language were standard, accepted ways of understanding deep psychological and spiritual struggles.
When he talks about the spiritus vertiginus darkening the senses and confusing the judgment so much that a person feels literally dizzy with anxiety, it sounds terrifying and alien to us.
But let's translate the core truth of it. While the specific demonic categorization belongs to his era, the underlying reality he is describing is a universal human experience.
Have you ever tried to sit in total, uninterrupted silence to pray and suddenly your brain bombards you with the most distracting, confusing, or even awful, shameful thoughts.
You start questioning your salvation, you remember something embarrassing you did 10 years ago, you feel completely dizzy with sudden anxiety, and you can't focus on God at all.
St. John is acknowledging that when you enter the quiet, the noise of your own untamed mind, and yes, very real spiritual opposition, will flare up violently to make you abandon the silence.
The medium is ancient, but the psychology is spot on. It's the brain violently rebelling against the stillness.
Exactly. He is validating the sheer horror of that experience. He isn't saying you're crazy. He says it's a severe goad, a real torment.
But he also insists that God allows this specific storm to chasten and prepare the faculties. It is a necessary part of the purging process.
You don't need to adopt a medieval monastic worldview to recognize the profound truth of what he's saying. Silence and surrender are violently opposed by our own fallen nature and by spiritual forces that want to keep us addicted to the noise.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. We've talked about all this intense effort we put into our spiritual lives.
All the reading, the fasting, the emotional worship, the frantic striving to be good enough, to feel enough.
But if St. John is right, if God's deepest, most permanent, most transformative work in your life actually happens in the pitch dark, when you are entirely passive, when your brain isn't working, and when you feel absolutely nothing.
How much of your current spiritual exhaustion, your burnout, your frustration with your faith, comes from simply trying too hard to do God's job for him?
Are you the one jumping out of the chair, grabbing the paintbrush in a panic, and ruining the portrait because you can't stand the stillness? Just sit, trust the artist, let the dark night do its beautiful unseen work. That's the heart of this section. This is discipleship for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.